you mentioned Eve and you mentioned Moses, okay? Well, let's think about the name NextStep Solutions, okay? Where did that name come from? What is the genesis of that name?
Oh, I like that. Genesis,
tied
Moses,
in.
Eve. You're very good, Steve. I wish I would have thought of that. Actually, we built the company 13 years ago on 4 cornerstones. Number 1, I've already mentioned. Life's a sales call. In fact, I wrote a book to that effect, and you'll see it during this interview, Life's a Sales Call. That's the first cornerstone. Number 2, a sales by definition is a relationship. It's not a transaction. And number 3, our job in sales really begins with the sale. It doesn't end with the sale. That's why we teach opening instead of closing. You open a relationship, you don't close a deal. And finally, the name of the company was the 4th and key cornerstone. You in sales and BD must own and control the next step of the sales process. You do that, you'll compress the process, and you'll get a customer to yes or no faster than anything else you'll learn.
So then the real question is, who ultimately do you want in control on that particular relationship? Do you want to take the control away from you, or do you want to take control of that relationship?
We always take control. That's what I say. Own and control the next step, and you'll win more sales and influence more people.
Okay, let me go back to something else you mentioned too. You really have me wondering about opening versus closing. When it comes to that most important phase in the selling or buying process, what do you mean? Expound a little bit more about the opening versus closing.
I had a real job back in the 70s and 80s. I call that my real job because it was my first one out of school. I worked for IBM. And they taught me the typical sales process. And they taught us to have 50% of our time, 10% of our time was discovering the needs of our future customers. Maybe 20% of the time was matching the IBM benefits with the needs of our customer. Another 30% of the time was really resolving the concerns they had. And the biggest bubble, 40%, was closing the deal. Just like that one movie, Glengarry Glen Ross, Always Be Closing.
Sure.
And you know what I realized? That was exactly in direct opposite of how people buy. So you'll see the snowman during this interview. What it should really be is turned around. We should spend the most time asking questions and discovering the needs of our clients. Then we should match only one thing, the unique value that Industrial Info and NextStep brings to the table against the dominant buying motive of our customers and clients. That takes the next most amount of time. Then if we do a good enough job, we're not going to have to resolve a lot of concerns because they're already convinced that we have something of value. And finally, the area where you should spend the least amount of time is opening the relationship. You know why? That's a natural extension of what you've already built earlier in the buying process. Hence, we open relationships instead of close deals.
It almost sounds, if you think about that diagram of the snowman, and you turn it upside down, well, what do people really need to do with the sales strategies they're employing? Kind of turn them upside down and focus more on the opening.
The people who view this are going to turn their whole opinion of sales upside down, and they're going to start focusing on what's really important. That's why people buy.
And you mentioned my...